Russ Weakley. Accessible Form, Hints and Errors.
Hey everyone, I hope you don't mind, but this is going to be an interpretive dance and it involves all of you, so I'd like you to all start warming up and stretching if you could. I've got to work out which hand's going to do which. So all these slides are going to be on bit.ly, but you can actually see this URL here. I did a short URL and then I realised it didn't look like hint error, it looked like terror, so I don't know what that means. But anyway, I'm going to start with some basic definitions and then we're going to move on. So I want to talk about inline hints and inline errors. And so probably should start with what they are. So an inline error message, these are error messages that are presented generally in close proximity to the form fields, the relevant form fields. And they're normally used to show that the field has been filled in incorrectly. Hope that's not a surprise to anyone. So we have a diagram here with age as our label and a form control and then our error message. In this case it says error, must be a valid age value. So generally speaking they should do a number of things. So the first one is they should the error should be associated with that relevant form field. The information in it should resolve the error if possible. And the third thing is ideally it should be really informative. In fact, in my slides fail a bit at this, they're really generic messages, but you shouldn't just say that's invalid, you should try and explain how it's invalid and how to improve it. And of course these messages should only appear when the user's filled in the form incorrectly. They're normally dynamically generated as the user leaves the form field, but sometimes they're done after the user tries to hit the submit button or anything like that. Yeah, that makes sense. So what about inline hints? So these are normally additional pieces of information that are associated with form fields, and their aim here is to, and they're close proximity. And there'd be something like this. The aim is to try and help users understand the field. So in this case we have a field saying password, and then our input, and then must be at least 8 characters or something like that. They're designed to help users fill them in correctly. But we want to talk about the key message today, which is why programmatically associated. What does that matter? I presume some of you have heard about this concept before? Yeah. Hopefully. So in order to make inline error messages and hints accessible, we need to talk about screen readers because that's why this programmatically accessible becomes important. And we need to talk about 2 modes, and we're talking about read mode and forms mode. So in read mode, the user is able to read and navigate around a page, but they don't interact with form controls in this mode. And then when we get to forms mode, that allows users to interact with a form. So that means they can fill in form fields, etc. And we're in this mode, they can only access things that have accept form focus, and that's the really important thing here. So when they're in forms mode, general content that is not a form element or can't receive focus is not going to be announced to the reader. And I'm going to use a quick example of just a paragraph of text that's after a form field. So if you did something like this, that's if it's an error message or an inline form hint, that's just a paragraph of text and it's placed after the field. But because it can't receive focus and it's not programmatically associated with that input, it's not going to be announced with that element at all. So it's not going to be announced while in forms mode. And the reason is because it's not programmatically associated with the form control. So our aim today is to make sure that we can programmatically associate both hints and error messages with our form controls. That's all we're going to cover today. So I'm going to talk about 3 methods that we can use for error messages. And one of them is slightly insane, but we'll cover that one last. So the first one is incredibly simple. I'm still amazed that people have moved away from this method because it's one of my favourites and it's just a win-win for everyone. If I was Charlie Sheen, I'd be something about endless winning, but probably all too young to remember Charlie Sheen and his meltdown a few years ago. So what we do here is we wrap the label around the label content, the form control, and the error message. So what we have is our label. We have our label content. In this case, I've wrapped it in a span so we could style it if we needed. We have the form control. In this case, it's an input. We have our error message. So they're all inside the label itself. And of course, you still need to have a foreign ID. A lot of people think that just because you wrap it round, it'll still work, but you still need to have a matching foreign ID. So on our label, we have 4, and in this case, error 1. And on our input, we have a matching ID value of error 1. So now they're programmatically associated. But the advantage of this method is that it works perfectly. Anything you put inside that label will be announced along with the label, so when it comes into focus. So it's an incredibly simple and easy method to use, and it's also incredibly well supported. So this incredibly joyous chart here. So we have VoiceOver, we have Windows NVDA and Windows JAWS, and in VoiceOver, quick tests were done in Chrome, Safari and Opera, in Windows NVDA, Chrome, Firefox and Edge, and Windows JAWS, Chrome, Firefox and Edge. And it's a pass across all 9 browsers. So it's a very simple and effective method. The question though is what happens if you can't wrap labels around form fields? In some CMSs it just can't be done. So there is that sort of case in some cases, and what we can do is get away with it. We're using the ARIA described by attribute. Has anyone used that in a while? Yeah? So what we have here is a label that's not wrapped around now. So we have the label, then we have our input, and then we have our error message. As you can see, our label is programmatically associated with our input, and it's using the error 2, so they both have the matching value. But the difference here is we now have the ARIA described by attribute. And what it's saying is this element is being described by another element. And so what we then do is put the matching ID on whatever we want to associate with it. So in this case, we're associating with the span element, which has a matching ID value of, in this case, D1. That's just so I could fit it on the slide deck. So again, this method is very well supported, and the only difference is IE Edge with JAWS. Now you're going to see that a lot today. IE Edge has sort of slipped down a bit. But what can I say? Who uses Edge? The third method is the insane one here, and this is the ARIA error message. Has anyone used this yet? No. It's probably a good thing. So this technique was introduced as part of ARIA 1.1 in December 2017. So it's very, very new. And for that reason, you'll notice very soon its support is poor, but it also has all these caveats about how it's used. So what they do here is we use the ARIA error message and the ID value to match them. So it's very similar to the ARIA described by, with some extra caveats. So what we have is our label. Again, this is if you can't wrap around it, you can use this method. We have our label at the top, we have our input, and we have our error message. We still have our for and ID, so in this case, they both have a matching value of error 3. But then we get to the different stuff. So now instead of ARIA described by, we're using ARIA error message. And it matches to the error, and it has the same value, in this case M1. But with the WC3 specification, they also have a bunch of other caveats. Now this is not a bad thing anyway, you should be doing this anyway. But what you do is you must have the ARIA invalid attribute in conjunction with the error message. So what that's doing is it's telling the screen reader that this field is now invalid. It's actually baked into the input rather than also having to do it on the error message itself. So what will happen is when the object or the field is valid to start with, the value is false. And then you can programmatically change it. So then it's dynamically changed to true. So this would be after the field has been filled in incorrectly in some form. But then they say in the specification, you should also use the ARIA live or the alert attribute as well. So does anyone know what the ARIA live attribute does? Can someone tell me? What does it do? On the money there. Depending on the browser, but yeah.
So it'll announce to the screen reader a message or something?
Depending on the attribute used. So it depends if you use off, then it won't announce it at all. If you use polite, it will do it the next graceful opportunity. If you use assertive, it should do it over the top of what you're doing. But the most important thing is actually not the part about the announcing. What ARIA Live does is allow us to notify the screen reader that it's a change in the DOM. So when you put it on an object, it will say, it will watch that space and go, I'm going to inject something here later, and you should be aware of it. The aspect about announcing it is actually the less important part of that. But in this case, they're suggesting that you should use the ARIA Live or the alert. Now, does anyone know one of the caveats about alert? Anyone who did a workshop with me yesterday would know it. What does the role of alert do, which is very similar to ARIA Live? It has an inbuilt ARIA Live of assertive attached to it. So alert, role equals alert, will operate just like ARIA Live assertive. So what they're suggesting here is use ARIA Live assertive. So if we just go back and look at it, we have our label, we have our input, type equals text or whatever you need, we have our span, we have the for and ID to match them together, we have our ARIA error message matching up with our ID, we have the ARIA invalid set to false or true, and now we have ARIA live assertive. So why do you think that would be put there? What advantage does it have to put that there?
As soon as the error is populated, it breaks in and goes, hey.
Yeah. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing? Has anyone actually uncovered this, by the way? It's quite funny.
If you tab off the error field...
I can't hear you talking, but... Yeah.
If you tab off the error field, you can't get back to it because every time you move, you just get error, whatever. So it's difficult to find out where your focus actually goes to.
Yep, that's one. There's another one, which is even funny. What happens if you tab down to the next field and it's shouting at you?
You can't able the next field.
Yeah, yeah. So while it's a WC3, 3 toilets, while it's a W3C's recommendation, it's slightly insane because it actually can shout over the top of everything. So the error message could, as I said, have an ARIA role of alert. But again, it's actually even worse because it shouts at you and adds to it, depending on your browser, alert. So I have some concerns, as we said. I don't like using assertive or alert on here. If I was going to do it, because it would be announced immediately, as we said, and it could talk over the top of the next form control. And in my testing, that's exactly what happens. When you leave the previous field, it shouts over the top of it and you can't hear the next field. So that would be a WCAG failure. You've actually failed to deliver something. And all this is, people's hearts are in the right place. You know what they're trying to do is, one of the things that we all struggle with fields is, when a user fills in a field, the problem is that they leave the field and then the error message is presented. And we struggle with this, like, how do we let them know? And the only way to let some users know is at the very end, when the field is glowing with all these errors and a sighted person can see them and a blind user can't, we have to send them back to the top of the field and say, actually, all these done. So the reason for this is actually the heart's in the right place. They're trying to say, hey, go back to this field and fill it in. I've also talked about the idea, and don't ever do this, but it's been the thought that's crossed my mind, of actually firing focus back into the field as well. Because you think, well, that'll help the problem as well. But this is beyond evil, because now you're not only yelling at them, you're taking control off them and throwing it back. It's almost like, you know, when you see an incompetent person on a machine, you grab the mouse off them and say, no, I'll just do it for you, you're an idiot. That's pretty well what you're saying, is you're just an incompetent fool, I'm going to send you back there to solve your problem for you. So don't do that at all. If you're going to do this sort of thing, which I don't mind at all, but use ARIA live of off. The advantage is now that the screener will be aware of the change, but it won't shout at them. Does that make sense? The other thing that's a great advantage of this is, if that's set to ARIA live off, we're really actually saying to them, watch this element, and anything that changes in there, be aware of it. So some older devices, when you're injecting an error message, some screen readers weren't picking that up. If you have ARIA live off, it's more likely to be picked up by the screen reader. So ARIA live per se is not a bad thing. Anyway, here's the dreaded message for you all, and I'll just jump straight to the chart to show you the glory. Bang, bang. So for those that can't see, there's a couple of failures across there, as in 9 out of 9. So that's why I was interested to see if anyone was using that in the wild, because, yeah, it would be interesting. So the thing is, this is a W3C, did I say that right this time? A recommended practice. So it may not be useful now, but the reality is it's probably going to become, you know, a tech move. 2 years from now, we won't be laughing at it. We'll be remembering this day together with joy, reminiscing about it all on our porches. But now we're going to talk about inline hints. And a lot of this stuff is going to be similar until we get to sort of complicated hints. So there are 3 different methods we can use to associate hints with our form controls. And the first method is really the work of Satan, but we'll talk about it anyway. And that's the placeholder. So what we can do is we won't, but you could use the placeholder like this. So in this example, we have our label, and then we have our input, and the placeholder is being used to provide the hint. Now, on very, very short, simple hints, you could possibly say it's acceptable, but it's a terrible practice. Why would it be a terrible practice? Why is a placeholder the work of Satan? Not that I have any problems with Satan. I embrace Satan, but what's that?
As soon as you focus, you lose what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it depends on the browser. Sometimes it's focus or sometimes the first character you type, but fundamentally it's the same. So I've seen people where they say, enter a password, and the password says, it must be 10 characters and a special symbol, and you've got to put your mum's birthday or something like that. And you're watching that, as soon as you type the first letter, you've lost all that instructions, and you don't know, it's insane. What's another reason why it disappears? What's another reason why?
Poor contrast.
Oh, look at that. It's almost like you read the slides. So exactly right. So we'll talk about it, then I'll show the error message, the problems with it. So in this case, we have the label, and we have the input, and we have our for and ID, because we're still always using good practice, but we have this placeholder attribute out the back. And the reason why, as we said, is the hint message disappears when the user interacts with the form control, either when it comes into focus or when they start typing. But as more importantly stated, no, we're on the wrong slide. It's especially bad for complex ones. But by default, it's got a very soft colour. Now, you can change the colour, but here's the catch when you do that, which I've done before. It then looks like it's filled in. So you've got this, you can never win with placeholders, so you should never use them at all. In any circuit, no, that's probably a bit too strong, but just use them sparingly. I've just been told, never use them ever at all. Not that it matters, but it's generally well supported. Again, a little bit of problems in Edge, and ironically in JAWS, Windows, JAWS, Firefox had some problems as well. What I love is has anyone heard VoiceOver when it hits a placeholder? Someone tell me where they've heard it. It's such a joyous experience. It goes into a deeper voice. So if we went back to it, it'll say something like, it's worth firing up to listen to, because it'll go, email your details. Come on, you've got to admit that's fun. That's the only reason I've found to use a placeholder. Okay, so there we have the joys of that. The next method is pretty much the same. So again, I cannot believe that people don't use this method as well for hints. So in this case, we'd have something like password, must be 8 characters, and the label can wrap around. So this is exactly the same as we used before. We have our label, we have the label content, we have the input, we have our, in this case, not an error message, our other message, and we have our for and ID, etc., and it's well supported. The same with array describe by. We don't need to go through that because we've done it before, but it's saying it works for hints as well. So it's a really good technique and it's well supported. But what I want to finish off with is what you want to do if you've got hint messages. Like, I work for a lot of banking corporations and there's a lot of lawyers involved, and when they're getting you to fill in something, they want to put a dictionary of information there attached to each field. Has anyone had this problem? Some of you? Yeah. So they say, well, we want like 67 paragraphs of text associated with it to help them fill it in properly. So what the hell do you do? So there are times when you have a longer message, and sometimes I've worked with people who want to do a pop-up message. So now we have something like this. It's a pop-up message that says the maximum number of given customers per month or something. Now, you'd normally use this if you had a lot more information you didn't want to sit below. I almost said shit below. That would have been terrible. So the two key questions we've got. The first one is, how do you make it keyboard accessible? And the other one is, where do you put it? Now, that sounds obvious. Almost everyone goes, well, you'd associate it with the form control. But do you always want to? Because sometimes it really shits blind users when you're telling them categories of information attached to each field. So maybe it's not always. Anyway, pop-ups, how do we do with it? Make it visible. And the quickest ways to do it is to do it on focus, hover, and active states. And then it can be hidden off screen. Now, I'm using a terrible simplified off-screen method just to show it here. Please don't use this in the wild. But you could set it to position absolute, shunt it off screen, and then voila, with the beauty of CSS, on hover, focus, and active, pseudo classes, of course, you can shunt it back on screen. Again, a crude method here, but to get the idea across. And that can work really well, and there's a demo there for you. But the big question is, where do you place it? Where do you put this thing? Well, the first one is inside or attached to it. So if it's critical, you probably do need to programmatically associate it with the field. And we can do it in two ways. We can wrap it inside or use array describe by. So we're going to use an example like this where the active customers, as we talked about before, we have our usual label, content, we have our input, we have the for and ID, and here we have an A element instead of, and I'm changing it to a role of button. And I've just shut down the projector. The presentation. Why would I put a roller button there? Well, it turns out if you try and put a button inside that label, it's going to fail. Why would it fail? We're running out of time, so I'll just answer for you anyway. Well, the first thing is, if you put a button inside something else, there's already a form control in there, so you're trying to shunt another form control in there. So WCAG guidelines will come and say, hey, you can only have one in there, like the Highlander, there can only be one in there. And then it says, plus you don't have a matching ID to it. So what we're doing here is, if you wanted to use, fundamentally a pop-up should be a button, not a link, because you're not setting somewhere. So what we're doing is we're changing the accessibility tree to say, actually, it's going to be a button. Okay, so have I gone backwards? The second method, there are two, oh yeah. And then the other thing is, I'm also doing something where I'm saying is defined as. So what happens is when they get the tooltip for screen readers, it goes active customers is defined as. So it's not shown in the tooltip, but it's actually a little bit of extra context so it makes sense to them. So the next method, running out of time. But what if it's informative, not critical? Now, I've talked to people yesterday at the workshop about a friend of mine called Andrew, who's a highly prolific blind user. And he gets very angry if he's provided with heaps of information about each form field. So another method is you could put it on as a link before, or a button before that field. And that's if it's useful but not critical. Again, this is debatable. So what we could do is, in this case we're saying must be a whole number, no factors, no decimal places or something is our tooltip. So what we can do is now use a button because we're before the field. And what will happen is you'll get to the button first. And you'll see up there, I've said for the following, so that can be hidden off screen. So what will happen is if you use a tabs to it, it's a focusable element. It'll say, for the following, do this, this, and this, and when you hit tab again, you'll get to the next element. So this sort of thing is debatable. It's up to you when and where you use them. What I object to is people just assuming that everyone will need every bit of information, and I've seen banking applications which drip with all this extra information, and sometimes that just doesn't help at all. So be careful about your users. So, just to wrap up, make sure error messages and hints are programmatically associated. Very easy to do. The simple method is just wrap them in a label. So easy to do if your CMS allows it. If you can't, use ARIA describe by. But the bottom line is, make sure you test with real users. Make sure you test with blind users and a variety of different users. If you're just testing with someone like my friend Andrew, who's extremely grumpy, and will say, no, don't do this. In fact, working on a bank app, once I worked with a woman called Giselle, who wanted extreme amounts of information, and then Andrew came along and said, I don't want any of that at all. So that's why it's important to test with a range of users, just like any other user testing. And I'm done.
Alley Camp, October 2018.